only God. And Quran, it is His word. Muhammad, he is God's final messenger. From his time to the end of mankind. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد.
In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Say, He is Allah, the One. Allah, the Eternal, the Absolute. He begets not, nor was He begotten. And there is none like unto Him.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. This evening's presentation is the first of 2 lectures on the oneness of God. And in this section of the lecture, I will discuss the belief in God. Because naturally, before we can look at issues of God's oneness, we would need to have concluded that there is a God. First and foremost, we should know that the belief in God is not something isolated. It is something which is quite ancient. The anthropologists who have studied human societies all over the world have all come to the conclusion that these societies have a belief in God, with very few exceptions. So from human efforts in terms of looking at the history of the belief in God, it is as ancient as man. Of course, from an Islamic perspective, it is even more specific in the sense that with the creation of God and the first man, Adam, with the creation that God made of the first man, Adam, the belief in God was given to that first creation. But from a practical point of view, from the point of view of human research, we can say that there is, from the efforts of scientists, a general conclusion that the belief in God is found throughout the earth. So much so that some scholars debated as to whether this is something intrinsic in human beings, being inborn, that human beings are born with this natural belief in God, or whether it is something which is acquired. The issue of what they say, and they refer to it as nature versus nurture. Of the exceptions, we can mention Buddhism in its ancient form, known as the Hinayana form of Buddhism, and Jainism. These are ancient systems which were supposed to have evolved or developed around the 6th century before the time of Christ. But even in these systems, though they don't speak about the existence of God, they do have a belief that the souls which attain a certain height of spiritual development, where they become liberated from the body, that these souls take on qualities of immortality and omniscience and become objects of veneration and worship. So, though they may deny the existence of God per se, they have given the attributes of God to some aspects of the creation, some of the created beings. And when we look at the philosophers of the past, ancient philosophers, we find both Plato and Aristotle amongst famous Greek philosophers who argued logically for the existence of God. And it really wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries, after the French Renaissance, that you find a body of philosophers proposing atheist ideas that God in fact did not exist. And among them, just to mention a few, we had Philip Mainlander, who was a German philosopher who died around 1876. And in his principal writing, The Philosophy of Redemption, he stated that the world begins with the death of God. Actually, he was the first to address the issue in this way, and all who supported his ideas became known as the death of God philosophers, and this philosophy being the philosophy of the death of God. In any case, he states that the world begins with the death of God. Since God is a principle of unity, shattered in the plurality of the world, and a principle of joy denied in the law of suffering which dominates the world. We also find Nietzsche, a Prussian philosopher who died about 1900. He supported this idea, proposing that God was nothing more than a projection of man's uneasy conscience, and that man was the bridge to the Superman. He had this idea of a human being who became beyond the normal human being as we know him, attaining for himself ultimately some of the attributes that we normally attribute to God. Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher of the 20th century, also claimed that God didn't exist because, according to him, God is a contradiction in terms. The idea of God, according to him, is a projection which man must make being what he is. From these beginnings, coupled with Darwinian teachings, we find atheism, or the idea that there is no God, spreading on a scale much greater than it had ever been known in history. In fact, out of this, we found Russia and China, along with Albania tagging on, holding as their state religion atheism. But though this is taught, and was taught, as the main foundation of education with regards to man, his existence, and the universe, most people who went through this system memorized what they were told from the statements of Marx, Engels, etc., repeated these for examinations, but within themselves, they did not deny God's existence, because it went against their very nature. And as such, with the crumbling of Russia, the Russian state, and Albania, and China to a certain degree, you find a huge rise in religious fervor amongst the people once again. With regards to the Quran and atheism, what we find is that there are very few verses in the Quran which deal with disbelief in God, because of the fact that there were very few who held this position. In one particular chapter of the Quran known as At-Tur, which is the 52nd chapter, we find the basic presentation, or the logical presentation of why the disbelief in God is illogical, wherein God says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ. This is the 35th verse. Were they created from or by nothing, or did they create themselves? And in the 36th verse, أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بَلْ لَا يُقِنُونَ. Or did they create the heavens and earth? Indeed, they are uncertain. These two verses summarize the basic three arguments for the existence of things without resorting to God. The first states that the creation came into being from nothing, or by nothing itself, spontaneously. And this approach violates basic reason. If somebody were to say that on some occasion, while they were walking in the park, looking at the ducks in the pond, they just saw a duck appear on the water, out of nowhere, not flying and landing or having been submerged and came out, but just appearing there on the surface of the water. No one would accept this. Why? Because it is illogical that this duck would appear from nothingness. All of our human experience indicates that there are causes, there are reasons. Things come from other things. They don't just come out of nothing. However, this line of argument, as obviously illogical and ridiculous as it is when put in simplistic terms, is a line which is being used by modern scientists, the atheists among them. We have, for example, Fred Hoyle, who advocated what was known as the steady state theory, which for some time was a rival to the Big Bang theory. In his theory, he argued that matter was constantly coming into being. And he said, this is a quote from his writings, "The most obvious question to ask about continuous creation is this: where does the created material come from? It does not come from anywhere." This is his answer. Material simply appears, it is created. At one time, the various atoms composing the material do not exist, and at a later time, they do. This may seem a very strange idea. I agree that it is. But in science, it does not matter how strange an idea may seem, so long as it works. That is to say, since the idea can be expressed in a precise form, and so long as its consequences are in agreement with observation, it is acceptable. This was Hoyle's argument. Of course, when he brought out this theory and his explanation for the existence, a number of known atheists or amongst the scholars also rejected this idea because, as they put it, this was opening the floodgates for religion, because it was violating the main principle of science, namely that nothing comes out of nothing. Now, this idea, however, in spite of the fact that it was rejected in the case of Fred Hoyle, those who argue the Big Bang theory, most say that the Big Bang began from a concentrated point of matter. Matter was in a very concentrated form, then this initial explosion took place where it started to expand, throughout the universe. Most scientists, when asked where did this original concentrated portion of matter come from, they will say that is not a question of science, and leave it. Right? Others among them, the affirmed atheists, will say it came from nothing, like Hoyle. It just came into being. And as we said, when we look at the existence, or when we look at the arguments for these ways of coming into existence on a simplistic level, the human intellect rejects it. So no matter how much scientific jargon may be placed around it, it doesn't change the fundamental ridiculousness of this type of argument. The second basic argument is that human beings or creation created itself. This is even more ridiculous, because to create something, that being or that thing which is creating must already exist. Right? If this world created itself, it means the world had to already exist before it created. And for this world to be created, it had to not exist. So you end up with an argument which is self-contradictory. So the idea of creating oneself, or the world creating itself, is one which has to be cancelled from the body of arguments as being totally illogical. The last argument, that the world was created from or by something which was already created, is the line of argument which states that matter really was eternal. It had no beginning. Because if we say that this creation, we call it C for creation, C1, that it was caused or created by another creation which we call C2. And that C2 was created by another creation which was C3. And we go on infinitely. Right? This is the argument, that there was no, it's from infinity. We're not going to identify a starting point. Because something which is created will need something else to create it. So if everything goes back eternally, this line of creators goes back into eternity, then what in fact we're saying is that nothing should exist. Because if creation number one cannot exist unless creation number two exists, and creation number two cannot exist unless number three exists, and then so on, then it means if we go back and we cannot find a starting point, then it means that there is no cause for our existence now. It means nothing should exist. But the reality is that things exist. Existence itself is proof of the falsehood of this line of argument. It is an ancient argument. You had amongst Greek philosophers those who argued also that the earth was eternal. Matter is eternal, the earth is eternal. It's just another expression of the same concept. But this is the most popular belief today, that it was matter, this which was eternal, which by accidental bouncing into each other, the early atoms or neutrons or whatever, bouncing into each other started, the process of life going. And even if we accept that matter was eternal, and we think of the accidental argument for things to come into being, which then lets us accept that molecules bouncing around eventually formed, bigger molecules, and these bigger molecules ended up forming the precursors of life, DNA, RNA, etc., eventually forming the first cell, and the first cell, eventually developing cell walls and crawling up on the land, and, this whole scenario which they have of how life came about. It is something which is more fantastic and more mythical than anything found in the religious books explaining how human beings and how the world got here. It is, in fact, another religion which has its own explanation of human beings.